afternoon, and welcome. My name is Monica Murray, and I am the Public Programming Officer at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORS. DORS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its people. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Too Good to Get Married. At this time, I'd like to hand things over to our guest speaker, who will introduce herself and begin the program. Bonnie, welcome. It's great to have you.
Hi, thank you so much, Monica. I'm going to just start right in on this talk. I will explain in the course of it enough about my background that's relevant to this, but welcome everyone, and thank you so much for your interest in my new book. So the first slide, please. The Alice Austen House is a museum, a city, state, and national landmark, and an LGBTQ historic national site. This photograph of the house was taken by Alice Austen in 1891. It shows her grandfather, John Haggerty Austen, tending the vines, covering a trellis on the front porch, which was called the piazza. In 1844, John Austen purchased this old Dutch farmhouse on a small parcel of land in Clifton on Staten Island, near the Narrows, which is now spanned by the Verrazano Bridge. He and his wife, Elizabeth Townsend Austen, were among the first generation of well-to-do New Yorkers to move to Staten Island, which was only a half-hour ferry ride from Lower Manhattan. Creating a suburban Eden, which they named Clear Comfort, John and Elizabeth bought additional parcels of land totaling 1 acre. They renovated and expanded the farmhouse, adding Gothic Revival trim, and they landscaped the grounds in the picturesque style, with winding paths and shaded seating areas. John was especially interested in gardening, as was his granddaughter Alice, who spent most of her life in the house and was still tending the garden in the 1940s, despite increasingly painful arthritis. When Alice took this photograph, she was 25 and her grandfather was retired, but still taking the ferry to his office in Lower Manhattan. John Austen died 3 years later at the age of 83. And I should just say that I'm calling Alice Alice throughout, mostly because in writing this book, there were so many Austens that it wasn't clear without calling them by their first names. But I mean no disrespect to her as a woman subject. So please bear with me on my familiarity with Alice. Before telling you about my book, Too Good to Get Married, The Life and Photographs of Miss Alice Austen, let me introduce myself and explain how I came to write it. In the 1990s, I was curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, and since leaving the museum staff, I have worked as an independent scholar and curator, organizing exhibitions and writing catalogs on New York photographers, including Bernice Abbott, Alfred Stieglitz, and Jacob Riis. My approach to research and writing evolved from my curatorial practice. By studying photographic archives, I developed fresh narratives about photographers already known to the general public, but in need of an up-to-date scholarly attention. Alice Austen, who hadn't been carefully researched for nearly 50 years, fit this model perfectly. I didn't know much about Austen until 2000, when I was asked to serve on a planning committee for a new visitor interpretation of the Austen House. At that time, I learned that her photographs belonged to the Staten Island Historical Society, part of historic Richmond Town. I went to the Society's library to view a set of 3-ring binders filled with modern prints from Austen's glass plate negatives. I also learned that there had been only one book written about Austen, published in 1976. Several years later, Maxine Friedman, then Historic Richmond Town's chief curator, asked my advice on updating the access and preservation of the Austen collection. She explained that in addition to the 3,500 glass plate negatives that had been printed for researchers, there were several thousand prints and negatives and film negatives unknown to the public. Although not a photography specialist, Maxine honed her archival skills and proceeded to direct the digital cataloging and scanning of the entire collection of 7,500 items. And subsequently, she researched the collection, identifying the people and events in the photographs. This was a godsend to me. In 2016, I committed to writing a book on Austen with historic Richmond Town support, and I took home a laptop that gave me access to Austen's photographs and their documentation. Next slide, please. It was not until 2018 that I began my research in earnest and discovered the goldmine that was the Austen family collection of memorabilia, including family scrapbooks and portraits and a cache of Victorian ephemera belonging to Alice. My favorite item among the calendars, greeting cards, and event programs is Alice's calling card, which inspired me to include the Miss in the title of the book. Next slide. The Alice Austen house owns a small but essential collection, which I was allowed to photograph. Most important are 700 letters written to Alice from friends and family. Even this relatively clear example of a letter, this one from Alice's mother, suggests the challenges of Victorian handwriting. Carly DeFillo of Historic Richmond Town transcribed the letters, working with Christine Alleghetti of the Austen House. In addition to the collection database, the letter transcriptions, and hundreds of iPhone snapshots of documents at my disposal, Maxine and Charles L. Sachs, her predecessor at Historic Richmond Town as curator, offered me their assistance. Both Maxine and Charlie had years of experience with the Austen photographs and are skilled at online records research, accessing everything from census records to ship manifests. Together, we solved many factual mysteries about the family and the photographs. With all these advantages, for which I am infinitely grateful, I struggled mightily to write this book. It took much longer than I expected to absorb the mountain of material I had accumulated, and there was a conceptual challenge, which was the result of how Alice, an amateur who photographed only for her family and friends, became known to a broader audience. Next slide. In 1945, when she was 79, Alice and her partner Gertrude Tate were evicted from Clear Comfort, which had been in her family, in Alice's family, for 100 years. This photograph of Alice and Gertrude was taken in 1944 by a young doctor who briefly rented the upstairs apartment of the house. Alice is on the left, seated because of her arthritis. On eviction day, Alice called Loring Macmillan, the director of Historic Richmond Town, in great distress. He managed to rescue her photographs and as much family memorabilia as he could, which accounts for the Austen collections at Historic Richmond Town today. In 1950, Oliver Jensen, a former editor of Life magazine, came upon Alice's photograph while researching another book, and then he discovered Alice herself still alive at 84. He arranged for Life to publish a feature article about her, which introduced her photographs and her life story to a national public. Although Jensen planned a book about Alice, he was unable to publish it, and not until the early 1970s did Anne Novotny, a picture researcher, learn about the Austen photographs and wrote Alice's World, the first and only book about her until now. Here's where the story gets complicated and interesting. Jensen and Novotny knew that Alice and Gertrude were a lesbian couple. Jensen had a warm personal relationship with both of them, but he and Novotny believed it was appropriate, given the homophobia of the times, to describe the two women merely as friends. While working on her book, Novotny left her husband, moved in with her business partner, Rosemary Akins, and began her own journey of self-discovery. Shortly after Alice's World was published, she wrote an article for a small feminist journal, Heresies, in which she declared Alice a lesbian artist. Thus, two separate stories about Alice emerged, ironically, both initiated by the same author. Next slide. Novotny's book, Alice's World, became a point of departure for the photographic community, which was drawn to Austen's portfolio, Street Types of New York. And this is an example of the street types. Surveys of the history of photography, written in the 1990s, inserted these Austen photographs into the early story of street photography, placing her in the company of photographers like Jacob Riis and Alfred Stieglitz, who photographed similar subjects in the 1890s. Next slide. Meanwhile, Novotny's article in Heresies attracted the attention of the lesbian community, which was drawn to Alice's satirical tableau of herself and her friends in costume, clowning before the camera, flaunting traditional gender roles. Lesbian activists in the 1990s took obvious delight in photographs like this one of Alice and two of her friends dressed in men's clothes. The street types and the dress-up photographs were singled out by contemporary audiences, but what did these photographs mean to Alice? And how did they fit into the larger story of a photographer who began taking pictures at 18 and continued for 50 years? My background prepared me to think contextually about the street types, but to understand the dress-up photographs, I needed to understand the role of women in American society during Alice's lifetime, which I offer here in brief summary. In the Victorian era, well-to-do women were educated to become wives and mothers and to make a home for their families, while men were educated in business and the professions. This sharp dichotomy was reflected in medical opinion of the day, which deemed women physically and mentally delicate, prioritizing their reproductive capacity, and assumed that they lacked sexual desire. When they reached their late teens, young men and women were brought together in controlled social settings for the purpose of finding mates and establishing new families. Growing up, girls often develop passionate feelings for other girls, which may have been the case for Alice, but these relationships, called romantic friendships, were not understood to interfere with the prospect of marriage. This was the world of Alice's upbringing. In the 1890s, American women began to challenge these conventions. They took up athletics. They wore less confined clothing. They traveled unaccompanied in public spaces. They attended college. They pursued jobs outside the home or built careers, and they experimented sexually. In 1894, when Alice was 28, the popular press introduced the term the new woman to characterize these controversial trends. As the backlash to the new woman gained force, women began to advocate for change, and efforts centered on women's suffrage, which resulted in the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Among opponents of the new women were so-called sexologists, doctors who questioned the presumption that women did not experience sexual desire and focused particular attention on women who rejected feminine behavior and chose to love women instead of men. Labeled inverts and later lesbians, these women were understood not only as a threat to the social fabric, but as mentally ill. This radically changed cultural landscape provides the background for Alice's life choices and the meaning of her photographs. Next slide. Born just after the Civil War in 1866, Alice was the descendant of an English colonist who had amassed great wealth. The parlor was a showcase for family heirlooms. This photograph features a chair that belonged to Alice's maternal great-great-grandfather, which she had to sell to the Met during the Depression, and has been returned to the house where it can be seen today. Alice's family, however, presented her with an unorthodox model of Victorian domesticity. The head of the household was her grandfather, John Austen, who had taken over his father's auction house, and her grandmother, Elizabeth, a devoted wife and mother, provided the family ballast. But neither Alice's mother nor her aunt conformed to conventional ideals of feminine devotion and sound household management. Her mother, also named Alice, returned home after a brief failed marriage, and her Aunt Min and Min's second husband, a Danish-born sea captain named Oswald Muller, traveled the world before retiring to clear comfort when Alice was in her teens. The family encouraged Alice's passions for shopping, scrapbooking, and athletics, supported her desire to travel, and did not pressure her to marry. Next slide. Alice entered society in 1883, engaged in a whirlwind of leisure activities, which he dubbed the larky life. She was devoted to tennis, a new sport open to women as well as men. Alice was so passionate about tennis that her family built her a tennis court. In 1886, she photographed this tennis party at Clear Comfort. These activities offered myriad opportunities for intimacy and independence among young people. The numerous letters of the 1880s from Alice's women friends expressed the excitement that these relatively unchaperoned events, tennis tournaments, boating competitions, amateur theatricals, and dances, inspired among them. Next slide. A competitor in all things, Alice was a local tennis champion and sought popularity with men as well as women. The more formal, flirtatious letters from men and the many dance cards that she saved indicate that Alice's interest in courting men's affection. And you can see in this card that all the dances are filled out with different suitors. And at my favorite detail is that on the bottom right, she's written home 4 a.m. In the mid-1880s, Alice took up photography, a fashionable and expensive hobby at which she excelled. Once introduced to the camera by her uncle Oswald, who was an amateur photographer, she perfected her skill on her own, specializing in portraits and landscapes that documented her Staten Island circle and their pastimes and her visits to resorts and the lavish homes of family members and friends. If we could go back to the tennis group slide, the last one. Thank you. In group portraits and tableaux orchestrated for the camera, Alice included herself within the frame, creating a kind of visual diary of her coming of age, and Alice is seen on the far left. If you look really closely, you can see that she's holding a shutter release in her hand on a rubber cord that connects to the camera, and which she's covered over with tennis rackets so that your eye wouldn't be drawn to it. Garnering great praise for her superior craftsmanship and giving photographs as gifts, she used photography to enhance her social status. Next slide. Next one, sorry. She had neither the need nor the time to participate in the activities of the burgeoning photography clubs of the day, nor was she interested in the artistic effects, idealized subjects, and debates about art that preoccupied her contemporaries who fell under the spell of pictorialism. This photograph of the famous gorge at Watkins Glen, which she took on vacation in 1892, illustrates Alice's ambition as a photographer and her detachment from the fashion for art photography. To reach the top of the gorge for this overlook, Alice wore an ankle-length dress and delicate shoes while carrying a wood box camera, tripod, and glass plates, not a feat for the faint-hearted. She titled the picture Artist's Dream, which suggests that she associated the sublime vista with paintings by the Hudson River School. But no, the fancy title was tongue-in-cheek. Next to the tiny bridge in the very center of the picture, in the distance, where her companions can be seen standing, is a sign that reads, Artist's Dream. Alice's title was literal, not aspirational. By 1891, when Alice and her friends reached their mid-20s and faced the prospect of matrimony, the underlying risks of the larky life had emerged. She came to realize the emotional costs of flirtatious behavior, including her own, and to understand that the social power of a popular girl crumbled in the face of marital obligation. Although she celebrated the marriages of several friends by photographing their new homes, she also used the camera to explore her feelings about women's social roles. This moment of reckoning inspired Alice's now famous photographs of her and her friends clowning before the camera, which were all taken within a 3-month period, August through October 1891. I only have time to discuss 2 of them, but together they reveal Alice's newfound skepticism of the mating rituals and gender roles that had preoccupied her for many years. Next one. The Darned Club depicts from left to right Alice, Trudy Eggleston, Julie Lord, and Sue Ripley. The 4 women were neighbors and friends since early childhood. Trudy and Julie were Alice's closest friends, Alice was less close to Sue Ripley, who was Julie's first cousin. Julie had recently married, and when the photograph was taken, she was 5 months pregnant with her first child. Alice took the photograph at clear comfort. The women stand on high ground in back-to-back pairs, their merged silhouettes creating a rhythmic design against the sky and harbor in the background. Trudy and Alice at left hug with their arms around each other, and Julie and Sue smile at each other as they place their hands on each other's waists. On the negative, Alice wrote in ink, "The Darned Club," which you can see at the lower left with her initials, AA. Next slide. The arrangement of the women derived from conventional photographs of women friends or relatives. When the now famous photograph was first published in Life in 1951, a reader sent the editor a photograph showing 4 young women standing in the same formation. That's the picture on the top. Juxtaposing her photograph with Alice's, she wrote, "Sirs, compare this photograph with that on page 141 taken by Alice Austen. The pose must have been popular. This one was taken about 1875 and is 4 of the 10 children of Julian S. Ramsey, Civil War mayor of Chicago." The name Darned Club was a pun. In a letter to Alice, her mother wrote, "Sue Ripley came here to say that the Darning Club would be put off until Tuesday and would take the form of tennis." The club was devoted less to darning and tennis than to keeping the women's friendship active, which for Julie, recently married and expecting a baby, may have felt especially urgent. Alice reported to Oliver Jensen in 1951 that the men in their set, who were miffed at being left out, came up with the name and the women adopted it. The Darned Club was the successor of the Young Ladies Cooking Club of Clifton, which these friends formed 5 years earlier and was known to prepare food to impress male guests. The change in focus from pleasing men to excluding them measures the women's shift in attitude. Next slide. 2 weeks before she took the Darned Club, Alice photographed herself and 2 friends dressed in men's clothes. This photograph, too, was taken at clear comfort, but Alice's friends shown here did not know each other. Julia Martin Center was a Clifton neighbor, but Julia Brett, on the right, had left Clifton when she was a child and was visiting her from her home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The 3 women are wearing men's trousers, shirts, vests, jackets, and shoes, and they have fake mustaches and darkened eyebrows. Alice, at left, dons a deerstalker hat and holds a fake cigarette. Julia Brett, at right, wears a high-crowned derby. And Julia Martin, at center, sports a straw boater and also holds a cigarette. It was not uncommon for women to dress as men in Victorian amateur theatricals. The Marsh Sisters' Christmas play and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women is a prime example. But this photograph exceeds the bounds of respectability. Seated, Julia Martin makes a mockery of male power by placing 1 foot on her knee and an umbrella between her thighs to suggest a giant erection. I don't know what prompted this irreverent assault on male swagger, but there is evidence that the photograph caused no alarm. When Julia Brett received Alice's package of prints in the mail, she was not home and her family opened it. She wrote Alice, "When I came in, the children had opened them and they were all out in full view. Of course, everyone caught on. The girls who saw them thought you the best." Next slide. Alice was as invested in the performance of idealized respectability as she was in the performance of disrespectability. When Julia Brett visited the following year, Alice set up her large camera in the corner of the piazza to take portraits of Julia and herself. She created a studio-like portrait niche by carrying outdoors an upholstered velvet chair, an oriental rug, a Chinese side table, and an inlaid planter. Wearing delicate summer gowns and posing like fashion plates, the women balanced gracefully on the edge of the chair to display the details of their dresses and their hourglass shapes. In one photograph, Julia looks out toward the garden, the afternoon light illuminating her refined profile. Next picture. In a second, she stares beguilingly into the camera. Alice may have encouraged Julia to enact the roles of innocent and seductress, well-worn tropes of popular illustration. Next picture. In her self-portrait, however, Alice did not adopt these poses, but maintained the direct, serious gaze that she had assumed in most of her photographs. Beginning to turn away from the larky life, Alice was also beginning to turn away from the ideals of Victorian womanhood. Next. In the next few years, Alice embarked on several photographic projects that suggest she considered, but then rejected, the idea of becoming a professional photographer. One of these was Street Types of New York, a portfolio of 12 small mounted prints between cardboard covers that bore the title, but notably not Alice's name. The project was most likely inspired by Street Types of Chicago, a souvenir book she saw when she visited the Chicago's World's Fair in 1893. Unlike that book, which presented street workers in a studio setting, Alice mapped out itineraries, and in a dozen trips to the city, she photographed people on the street where they worked. Taking the elevated trains with a companion to help carry her equipment and keep curious passerbys out of the way, Alice netted 44 negatives in the spring of 1896. Alice had regularly traveled with her mother to go shopping, a habit that accustomed her to travel with strangers on public transportation to districts where women congregated. But the Street Types project required her to move beyond these districts, to approach strangers of the lower classes, and to draw attention to herself with camera and tripod. Once a photograph was taken, Alice and her helper left the site quickly to avoid comments or questions, and after 3 or 4 interactions, they were finished for the day. I was unable to determine precisely why Alice embarked on this project that yielded a small number of portfolios that she gave to friends and family, and a large number of prints that remained in her collection. But the sheer audacity of the project bears the hallmarks of the new woman. After visiting Chicago under chaperone, she flouted the traditional constraints on women to move around a big city, her city, pushing against boundaries of class, gender, and public space. Next. While she was working on the Street Types, Alice began spending time with Violet Ward, who, like Alice, had been a top tennis player at the Staten Island Ladies Club in the 1880s. Violet introduced Alice to Daisy Eliot, who, unlike Alice and Violet, had studied to pursue a career. The daughter of a prominent Brooklyn physician, Daisy graduated from the Brooklyn Normal School for Physical Training, which advocated the benefits of rigorous physical exercise for women. Daisy was athletic director at the Berkeley Ladies Athletic Club in Manhattan, where she taught a regimen of exercises adapted from men's calisthenics and military drills. Violet, who was a club member, enlisted Alice to take photographs at the gymnasium. In this photograph, Daisy wears a billowy white blouse and full bloomers, and her 4 students, including Violet, who's seated at left, wear military-style jackets, which signal the masculine derivation of the women's exercises. Past their prime as competitive tennis players, Alice and Violet were perfectly poised to take up the latest sports craze, bicycling. The passion for bicycles began with the English invention of the safety bicycle, which had 2 wheels of equal size, a chain drive, and pneumatic tires. By 1895, 300 American bicycle companies produced 500,000 safeties. That year, Violet enlisted Alice to co-found the Staten Island Bicycle Club. Perhaps inspired by Daisy, who had published several articles on women's physical culture, Violet wrote Bicycling for Ladies, a guidebook for women cyclists. While every bit a practical guide, Violet's book addressed the fierce backlash against women's cycling, which required women to wear less constricted clothing, encouraged so-called overexertion, and gave them the means to travel alone. Some passages of Violet's book read like a new woman's manifesto. Riding the wheel, our own powers are revealed to us. The system is invigorated, the spirit is refreshed, the mind freed from care. You have conquered a new world, and exultingly, you take possession of it. I love that. Next slide. The book's illustrations are based on Alice's photographs of Daisy and show the correct and incorrect ways to mount, ride, carry, and repair a bicycle. On the lawn at Clear Comfort, the women set up an outdoor studio. Daisy wears full-legged bloomers, which provide a clear view of the position of her legs. To simulate movement, she sometimes balances on the bicycle unassisted, as in this example. While working on the bicycle book, Daisy's letters to Alice reveal that she, Violet, and Alice became entangled in a love triangle. Daisy was older and more independent than Alice and Violet. She had a career, she traveled to Europe with a companion, not a chaperone, and she had a history of love affairs with women. Daisy, it seems, lit the fire that led to several years of drama and heartache for the three of them. Unlike the intimate but guileless letters that Alice received from her other women friends, Daisy's letters imply amorous emotion in coded prose. "There's a good deal more between the lines than in them," she wrote. "Read as much as you care to, and you will not be mistaken." Her elliptical language reflects the rise of alarmist views about women's sexuality. Openly acknowledging love for another woman had become perilous. For the details of this unhappy drama, you will have to read the book. For me, the affair signaled a transition from the permissive norms of romantic friendship to forbidden love. And for Alice, it was a meaningful step towards self-discovery. When she met Gertrude Tate at a Catskill resort, she understood her feelings for her. When Alice met Gertrude in 1897, the Tate family was in mourning. Gertrude's father, Henry Marshall Tate, had died suddenly at age 52 of a heart attack. Tate was a successful public accountant who settled his family in a townhouse in Clinton Hill, an up-and-coming Brooklyn neighborhood. And Gertrude and her older sister Carrie were regularly mentioned in the Brooklyn Society pages. Tate left enough money for his family to remain in their home, but money was a source of concern. Next slide. This photograph of Alice and Gertrude was taken at a commercial studio in Stapleton, a village near Clifton. By 1900, Alice and Gertrude had reoriented their lives toward each other, but Gertrude lived with her mother and sister in Brooklyn until 1917, when she moved to Clear Comfort. At the start of their relationship, their 5-year age difference was significant. In 1900, Alice was 34 and ready to embrace domestic life after several years of frenetic productivity and emotional turmoil. Gertrude was 29 and at a crossroads. In the wake of her father's death, she wanted to earn a living. She studied to become a kindergarten teacher, a new profession based upon the idea that young children learn through organized play. And she trained as a dance teacher, another new field in which she learned to teach diverse styles of dance, from folk to aesthetic to ballroom. Although Alice chose not to pursue a career in photography, she introduced Gertrude to Adeline Robinson, a friend and former tennis champion, to advance Gertrude's career. Adelaide taught ballroom dancing to the children of prominent families in many locations on Staten Island and Manhattan, and Gertrude became her assistant. By 1908, Gertrude was teaching her own classes for adults and children. Like many independent women of her generation, Gertrude built a career by professionalizing the skills that had been traditionally assumed by the wives of well-to-do families. Next. Alice's photographs of Gertrude at Clear Comfort reveal her pleasure in Gertrude's grace and beauty. In a formal portrait, Gertrude sits in a parlor chair in the corner of the piazza wearing a ruffled dress, in a reprise of Alice's 1892 portraits of Julia Brett. Unlike those stylized performances of the virtuous maiden and the femme fatale, Gertrude appears unaffectedly feminine, an ideal personified. According to Gertrude's sister Winifred, whom Anne Novotny interviewed in 1975, Gertrude liked luxury, and Alice could give it to her. While Gertrude lived in Brooklyn with her mother and sister, she and Alice created a sumptuous life together, spending summers in Europe, making excursions by automobile, and cultivating a Manhattan presence. Between 1903 and 1912, they traveled abroad for 3 to 4 month vacations, skipping only 2 summers. Alice brought a 4x5 camera to Europe and switched from glass to film negatives, which were lighter and allowed for more exposures. Next. Many of Alice's travel photographs suggest that they experienced greater freedom as a lesbian couple abroad than at home, sometimes traveling with lesbian friends. These glorious vacations were surely the high point of their lives together. One of Alice's last European photographs is a self-portrait, her face reflected in an oval mirror atop a dresser in the tiny cabin that she and Gertrude shared on the SS Cleveland on their final transatlantic voyage in October 1912. At home, Alice and Gertrude walked a tightrope between their private and public lives to maintain the appearance of respectability. According to Winifred, they socialized in Manhattan with a small group of homosexual and lesbian friends, never mixing them with the old Staten Island country club families. In both Manhattan and Staten Island, they live within communities defined by class privilege. In 1909, Alice joined the New York Social Register, a publication inaugurated in the Gilded Age to distinguish people with old wealth and colonial ancestry from parvenus. And in 1914, she joined the Colony Club, another marker of class status. In 1917, Winifred Tate and her mother moved to an apartment building, and Gertrude, age 46, moved to Clear Comfort. The following year, Aunt Min died, and Alice inherited the property. Gertrude may have felt more at home on Staten Island than in Brooklyn, where she faced the opprobrium of her mother and older sister. As Winifred reported, neither her mother nor her puritanical sister Carrie admitted openly that Gertrude was a lesbian, but that was undoubtedly what upset them so much. By the 1920s, Alice and Gertrude formally presented themselves as a couple in the listings of the Social Register, the Richmond County Country Club, and the Colony Club. Their age, the discretion of their peers, and Alice's money protected them from the overt discrimination that younger and less privileged lesbians experienced. But they were living beyond their means. And in 1929, Alice lost everything in the stock market crash. For 15 years, she and Gertrude struggled valiantly to keep Clear Comfort, but in 1945, as I have mentioned, they were evicted. For 4 years, they lived together in a 3-room apartment in St. George, but Alice's severe arthritis became too much for Gertrude to manage. In 1949, Gertrude yielded to Winifred's urgings and moved to Winifred's home in Queens, which left Alice alone. An obstinate resident, Alice was shunted from one nursing home to another until June 1950, when she was admitted to a public facility, the Staten Island Farm Colony. To qualify, Alice, age 84, transferred her remaining assets to Gertrude and declared herself a pauper. Shortly thereafter, Oliver Jensen found Alice's photographs at the Historical Society and visited her at the farm colony. Interviewing Alice for Life, he asked her why she never married, and she replied, "I guess I was too good to get married," a remark I've borrowed as the title of my book. To conclude, I want to return to Alice's photography, which languished once she had settled down with Gertrude. When Alice switched from glass negatives, which she printed herself, to film negatives, which had to be developed and printed by a commercial lab, she gave up much of the craft of photography. Because commercial printing was expensive, she did not bother to have prints made of most of the 3,000 film negatives in her collection. The reason for the decline, however, is not just technical. Alice's reliance on film negatives reflected a change in her ambition. In the 1880s, Alice's beautiful prints were her social currency, garnering gratitude and praise from family and friends. In the early 1890s, most notably in the famous dress-up photographs, photography helped her assess and reject Victorian norms of femininity and marriage. This process expanded her horizons, which in the mid-1890s led to her experiments in photography, most notably the street types of New York portfolio. Once she settled into domestic life with Gertrude, photography was no longer central to her sense of self. We remember Alice Austen for her innovative photographs and for her loving partnership with Gertrude Tate, two distinct chapters in a justly celebrated life. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. We do have some questions that have started to come in already.
Good.
And I would encourage anybody else who has questions for Bonnie at this point, please do drop those in the Q&A chat there at the bottom. Q&A at the bottom, not the chat. But this was fantastic. So thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm very proud of this book, I have to say. It was really hard to do, and took many years. But to just try to come up with a plausible narrative. But I think I'm committed to it.
Well, I can tell, and actually that leads into a question that I have just immediately, which is you mentioned that when you first started, Alice Austen hadn't been studied in nearly 50 years.
Right.
Why do you think that was? And, yeah.
I really don't know. I really don't know. I mean, people had written about her like in chapters. First of all, I mean, people have written about her, but without doing new research, so that's what I mean about my really being drawn to photographers who are known, but where there's really need for like starting from the beginning and seeing, and not just going on, secondary sources and, working out, and really just going back to the original sources to create a new narrative. And in this case, it was super extreme of, how much material there was to absorb, compared to, I mean, Novotny was a picture researcher and she did an incredible amount of research, but she was also under a very tight deadline with her publisher, which thank God Fordham University Press let me be 3 years late on this. But she wasn't in that position, and there were no footnotes in her book and no index. So, her word just became gospel because she was a researcher. It has the aura of research, but, it just became increasingly out of date. But I don't, I just think that's the only reason I can think.
Well, thank you for that. Here's a possibly simpler one, but who owns the copyright to Alice's photographs?
Well, that opens a very interesting question, which is that the collection, as I said over and over again, belongs to Historic Richmond Town, so they have the copyright. But the collection, this will be announced on. There is a press release already out, but this will be formally announced at the book event we're having at Historic Richmond Town on Saturday. That Historic Richmond Town is transferring the photo collection to the Alice Austen House. And this is huge. The Austen House, which under the dynamic direction of Victoria Monroe, who's been there since 2018, has, done a great deal for their website and for their programming, and also this is one of those COVID situations. They were really able to work on their collection during COVID, when they couldn't do programming. And I mentioned that there was an apartment in the house, that there was a man who lived there in 1944. Well, there had been, when the house became a museum in 1985 and 83, there was always a caretaker in that apartment because the house is right on the water, very exposed, kind of isolated, and they needed to have someone living there so it wouldn't be vandalized or it wouldn't catch fire by mistake or by accident or something. So turning over a new leaf, the house is taking over that apartment, and that's where the collection will be stored, and they raised the money to renovate that space. So it's a big deal. So the house will soon, when this transfer becomes complete, will hold the copyright.
Thank you for that. was a lot bigger than I was expecting.
Yeah, it's really an
Very
amazing, it's a huge
things.
event in the world of Alice Austen and in terms of Staten Island museums too.
Yeah. So you spoke a bit about how Alice never like mixed crowds, so to speak, among her Manhattan and Staten Island friends. And so I was wondering that could you expound a bit more on how Alice navigated the expectations of Victorian society on Staten Island, especially as an unmarried woman and as an artist?
Well, that's tricky. I mean, I only know what I can intuit from shreds of evidence. I mean, was a big lesson for me because I'm not a gender historian. Was how much you have to work with when you're studying a subject where sort of censorship, self-censorship and external censorship is sort of written in to the evidence. You have to kind of read through the lines. That one line from Winifred, from the Anne Novotny interview, is the only direct evidence that said she had these two crowds of people that she associated with. But there are these other little bits of evidence to show that's how that she did function that way. So it's a little bit of a leap on my part, which I have again was encouraged from various readers, peer reviewers to just to go for it. But I do feel what I kept feeling more and more was that Alice Austen was very provincial always, but that part of that especially was she used her class and her her very small world to protect her. And I think people that knew her all of her life, and they were really socially adept couple in public, and I think they just finessed it. I also think they gravitated toward some of their closest friends were a little bit more socially what we would call progressive, and accepting, and maybe themselves were involved in, some queer relationships, again, sort of under the cover of respectability. So I was really fascinated with the fact that if you look at the annual records of, say, the Colony Club or the Social Register, that all of a sudden, after like really 10 or 15 years after Alice is listed as a member, that Alice and Gertrude are listed with the same address. But by this point they're in their 60s. So I think that, as I say, it was they finessed it. They did what they had to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Another question here we have is, so today, Alice Austen is really celebrated as an LGBTQ icon.
Right.
How do you think she would have felt about that recognition?
It's beyond. I think that's an historical. I mean, I'm sure, given the world she grew up in, she'd be horrified. Because it's just. I think. I do think the people. Oliver Jensen knew her. Another person that knew. The people, and Anne Novotny. Didn't know her because she was writing in the 70s. But I think that growing up in that world, it was important to protect her. And so it's just a different world. I don't think it's a question you can, it would be asking her to be a different person. And it is important to emphasize, I think, how culturally conservative she was. She was born in 1866 and she came of age during Reconstruction. So, there is there is, and she definitely believed in the sort of, I mean, she was not, there are, she believed in the sort of natural superiority of her class, not just that they were, lucky to have come early, earned money early. And, she that was the social world she belonged to.
Okay. With that said,
I don't know if that really answers your question, but I just don't, it would be asking her to not be part of the world that she grew up in to say, oh, she would think it was great. It's really
Well, it
hard
makes
to
sense.
say. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not giving her credit. Maybe if she's somehow looking down from, heaven and seeing what's going on, she thinks it's wonderful. But I don't, in the world she lived in, it was just beyond possibility.
It's 2025 is a very different time than she was living in, for sure. Another question that we have, just for clarity. So she never actually achieved fame during her lifetime.
No. And I don't think it's very interesting. I mean, it's the closest she came to publicizing her work was the portfolio, the New York Street types where she actually commissioned, she paid to have those prints made by a company that made their ink prints. They're not photo paper prints. They're not and she and she didn't put her name on it. It's kind of shocking. And there is in the book, I sort of go, she had several other like little forays into attempts to make pictures that were for a general audience, not for her friends. And there is some evidence of really trying and failing to sell prints or publicize her work. She was very much bound by class. I think she felt that money, that women don't involve themselves in commerce other than shopping. And so again, that's another part of her conservatism. And one of the most, many women were like her, of her in the 1890s, who were good amateurs, became professionals. The most parallel example is Frances Benjamin Johnston, who was a New York photographer from a very, well-to-do family, who went for it. She became an internationally famous photographer. She wrote stories about, she photographed the sort of famous people she made portraits of Washington's most famous people. She did early photojournalism, traveling around the world. She wrote articles for ladies' magazines about how to become a professional photographer and got many responses. And, so she was a fascinating character, and she was a lesbian, and she was a bicyclist. But, she was much more willing to take on the world as a photographer. And Alice Austen just shrank from that. It just wasn't for her something that she felt comfortable with.
Thanks. So we have someone here who says that they grew up their first 16 years on Staten Island, 53 to 69, but didn't actually learn of Alice Austen until well into their adult years. So is your book more of a textual cradle to grave biography or a pictorial biography?
Oh, that's a nice question for me. I try to make it both. The book, the book has 143 illustrations, and Historic Richmond Town subsidized the printing so that the pictures could stand as pictures, and that you would really, it's not a coffee table book because it's also got 50,000 words and 600 footnotes. But I really tried to do both, to kind of do this very seriously researched biography. And again, I'm not a biographer, but because of the nature of this material, it was like, I can't explain these pictures unless I go deeply into trying to understand who this woman was in a very kind of intimate level. So I really tried to do it all in this book. And I love the book. I mean, it came out really beautifully in my view, which is not, I can't say that for all the books that I've been involved in. And I mean, Fordham they really listened to me and worked with me on the layout to make sure that, the pictures that needed a full page or a bigger, were given that much space. I wrote captions for all the pictures so that you can just browse through and get the point of each picture from the caption without having to dig in the text to find out why it's there or what it is. So, I really tried to do both to make it a picture book and a biography.
I think that this question kind of goes with that, actually. It's a good follow-up. But I know you mentioned it took much longer than expected to write this book.
No kidding.
Viral. And I would just imagine that going through collections like this would be exhaustive. So how did you decide what to include and what to leave out? And is there anything that stands out as something that you didn't want to, but you had to leave out because you couldn't write?
No, I didn't have that. I mean, that plays to my experience. I mean, I'm a curator, I know, and I've also been a curator at a history museum, so I'm used to trying to balance out, to tell stories through pictures and make the pictures foremost. So once I got, it was really getting the narrative down that was so hard. And that once I knew the story I wanted to tell, the part of choosing pictures or, wasn't that hard. That kind of, that was comfortable for me. And I had, there were specs in my contract that I was given a maximum of 150 pictures and I used it, and maximum 50,000 words and I used it, so I am used to sort of writing to length and, doing what I'm told in that regard. So that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was just figuring out what I thought and what I thought the pictures meant. I mean, it was really confusing to me that these, especially the satires, the most famous pictures, were taken at a time when the term lesbian was not even used. When that was the big challenge for me. How was it possible that in the 20th century or 21st century, people look at those pictures and say, those are lesbian pictures. We know exactly what's going on there. And yet the world that they were made in was very different. And it literally, so that getting that idea, which I did spend time on to try to lay out the whole way to understand women and women's sexuality changed from within the eras of the nearly 100 years that Alice lived, really helped. Once I understood that, really helped me try to make sense of those pictures.
Well, thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question here, and then I'll turn it back to Monica. But is there any movie film in the collection? Just given the timing with 16 millimeter being introduced in the 1920s, it seems likely that Alice might have been curious.
Did she use a movie camera? Yes, she did. And actually, and Charlie Sachs, who was the curator of the collection in the 1980s, had the film conserved with like I can't remember if it was a NISCA grant or but with a public grant. And then he did a showing of little excerpts from her movies. I've seen the excerpts because it was on a VHS tape, which I had digitized, and she was using the movie camera. First of all, there's no evidence that she ever edited or showed it or anything. She was very into a lot of gadgety cameras in her later years. She tried a lot of cameras. She loved the camera, but she wasn't involved in product anymore in the later years. She was fooling around with it. So the movies are the same subjects as her late pictures, which are her house, the yard, her cats, the animals, her friends, social gatherings, and they're just little snippets. They're charming, and they're totally charming, but they're not finished movies. There's no work of art there. And those could be, it would be interesting. As I say, I've only seen the program that Charlie Sachs put together as a public program in the 80s. It would be interesting to see more, but I'm sure he chose, he chose the best, to give a sense of what she was doing.
Well, thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you for all of this today.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. And thanks everyone for coming who came. I appreciate it so much.
All right, great. So thank you, Bonnie, again for taking the time out to share your research on Alice Austen. It was really great to learn more about Alice and how she contributed to New York City history and Staten Island's Victorian society. If you're interested in purchasing To Get Married, please click on the link pasted in the chat and be sure to use the promo code Doris-FI for 25% off. And thank you to our audience for attending. And we hope to see you next week for our next Lunch and Learn, A Home Away from Home. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks again.